Thank you to Katarina Schmidt, Mohammed Ajar, Rosia Da Riva, and Benedict Hensel for organizing and lining up this very fine list of speakers for what promises to be a most interesting and beneficial conference. I want to open my discussion of tribal kingdoms and the tribal element in the Southern Levant Iron Age by noting the contested status of the concept of tribalism as a theoretical construct. For the famed Arab geographer Ibn Khaldun, tribalism was simply group solidarity, as-sabiyya, a felt sense of belonging. It is a means to identity and belonging that is based to varying extents on kinship, genealogy, and ancestry. The ethnographic record is replete with examples that highlight the remarkable malleability and flexibility of tribal belonging, a key feature that makes it so resilient and persistent. In a recent conference at the London School of Economics, the social anthropologist Andrew Gardner observed that in the contemporary context, tribes comprise a social stratum occupying the identity space between the nuclear family and national belonging. I think this is a very helpful framing of what might be meant by the word tribe. He went on to note that the segmentary logic of tribalism made it ideally suited to well-together households dispersed over vast tracts of land, and who as a result may encounter one another only sporadically or seasonally. Due to the Eurocentric theories that originated in the 19th century about the evolution of human society, tribalism remains and retains a connotation of primitiveness, and it continues to be framed as a social form antithetical to modernity and otherwise problematic to development. Tribalism is thus a concept that few Westerners has a personal understanding of. The reason is that for centuries, this identity space between the nuclear family and the nation has been in the process of being dismantled or even replaced. From its traditional function as a unit of production, the nuclear family has become a unit of consumption in a cultural program that some anthropologists have dubbed utopian consumer capitalism. Now, my primary focus of research, as most of you know, is not Edom. It is rather Heshbon in central Jordan. However, the problem of the rise of kingdoms in Jordan during the Iron Age is one that we've been studying at Heshbon as well. And the project there is led by three of us, in addition to myself, Bethany Walker and Maria Elena Runza. And we have for now many decades enjoyed the great cooperation of the Department of Antiquities, the people and the various organizations in Heshbon, and the Malba Plains Project, and of course SELA, which continues to work with us in maintaining the site. Now, we of course stand on the shoulders of biblical scholars with scientific minds. The original leaders of the Heshbon expedition, Siegfried Horn, Roger Boris, Larry Garrity, and Jim Sauer. Now, my perspective is that of an anthropological archaeologist. I am interested in identifying analytical lenses for investigating drivers of cultural production and change over la longue durée in Jordan and the Southern Levant. This began with an effort to repurpose the original Heshbon expedition from being a focus on primarily biblical and historical questions to rather looking at how people produced their food and security and water over the centuries, because this was a question that applied to all the layers, not just to the biblical layers. And as a result, I produced a volume, my doctoral dissertation that became Heshbon 1, in which I documented the changes over time in the intensity to which the food system was raised, and this periods of boom and bust shown in the cycle. Now, in the little image on the lower right-hand corner, with an artist, try to reconstruct changes over time in the landscape, involving shifts in emphasis with 4 different strategies of food production, namely scale production with oxen, hillside production of grapes and olives with primarily mules and donkeys, sheep and goat pastoralism, and camel pastoralism. And from the study of animal bones in particular, I began to see these changes over time. And those changes were documented in these 2 volumes, especially also in Faunal Remains volume. Now, to come back to the problem of the rise of the state in the Levantine lands, back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was an effort to bring the insights of the new evolutionist anthropologists to understand the rise of the state of Israel. In particular, Frank Frick in Formation of the State in Ancient Israel. He drew on the work of an anthropologist by the name of Elman Service, whose model is shown here that depicts a progress from band, tribe, chiefdom to state as a linear process involving increasing rise of hierarchy with gradual increase in elitism, fully established elitism, along with which also came greater specialization of labor, increased scales of violence, and expanding trade networks. So in the model for the state of Israel that Frick posited, the 12th and 11th century, or the period of the judges, is a time of tribalism, whereas with Paul we get the first chiefdom, and then with David and Solomon we get the first state. So he fully embraces this linear development. Now, a number of scholars have engaged this question, and I would say that we were among probably some of those that not only challenged this linear view, but opted for a different view that we came to call the tribal kingdom model. And this we published, Randy Yonker and I, in the benchmark volume published by Tom Levy, a collection of papers on the archaeology of society in the Holy Land. In our article in that volume, we show how environmental affordances are related to intensification toward complexity. And as you go toward the south, we predicted it would be harder to pump up the system to the state level, and that because of the increasingly difficult environmental affordances. Later on in a volume edited called Ancient Ammon, I also posited 10 characteristics or salient features of what we call the tribal kingdom. Now, this idea of the tribal kingdom has since been defended and developed by a number of other scholars. Here I'd like to highlight Evelyn van der Steen and Piotr Bienkowski. Evelyn in Tribes and Territories in Transition reviews ethnographic sources from the 19th century and then draws on this material to illuminate the process of state formation in ancient Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And she's continued to do that in several more recent articles, and I believe in other books. And in a edited volume, Studies in the Iron Age, Piotr Bienkowski makes the case for the tribal kingdom notion as an improvement over what he calls the traditional model or the biblical archaeology paradigm, which interprets the Levantine kingdoms of the Iron Age as bounded nation states on the 19th century European model. He also defends the tribal model against competing proposals and offers suggestions for archaeological correlates for researching this model. Further refinements of this model are then seen in Tom Levy, Mohammed Najjar, and Eretz Ben Youssef's volume, New Insight into the Iron Age, which is a report on their work in the Fenn Copper District. In the volume, they contrast the foreign domination versus local autonomy explanation for the rise of a tribal kingdom in Edom. They favor the latter model and highlight the importance of the segmentary lineage system as key to understanding the rise of the state level society in Edom. Then, in a chapter in the edited volume, The World Around the Old Testament, Joel Burnett surveys textual sources from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia that emphasize, with reference particularly to the Ammonites, the kin-based structure of society in relation to its ruling house. So these rulers of distant centers of civilization noted that there was something different about the social structure of society in the Levant. The reference to these rulers is evidence not only of their agency and relevance, despite their standing as heads of subordinate vassal states, but also as the influence of the activities and productions of these peoples. Now, there are also critical takes on the tribal kingdom model, and I would highlight here first in the volume Moab in the Iron Age by Bruce Routledge, in which he objects to the ideas of unilineal descent and tribalism as key to understanding state formation in Iron Age Moab. Instead, he introduces Gramsci's notion of hegemony as a basis for understanding this process. But my question is this: while his hegemonic model does have some merit at the level of imperial domination, understanding that, does it really aid our understanding of local social organization? Also, is his model perhaps a workaround to avoid using the contested notions of tribe and tribalism? If so, does it not risk substituting one Eurocentric construct for another? In complex communities, Benjamin Porter argues that the tribalism model is a convenient default explanation in the absence of solid empirical evidence and objects to its implied assumptions of cultural continuity, both good critique. He then offers the patrimonialism model as an alternative for understanding the social structure of the communities that emerge in southwestern Jordan in the Iron Age. But for him, my question is, what about seeing patrimonialism as just another version of the kin-based system of social order? That is, in fact, tribalism, but in this case, adapted to a more sedentary agricultural way of life. Again, is this too perhaps a workaround to avoid using the contested notions of tribe and tribalism? Now I want to take a brief detour and talk about the concept of agency, because I believe it opens to understanding of complexity without monumentality, as I think to a large degree we have in the case of the Iron Age polities of Jordan. So a pivotal book in this regard, one that sort of is cited by most people that are trying to move beyond the traditional Eurocentric perspective, is Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History, in which he offers a history of the contributions of the invisible masses who since 1400 AD participated as slaves and low-paid laborers in the colonial project of producing cash crops for export to Europe. This book opened for renewed consideration the concept of agency and the agency of invisible actors by anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians. Inspired by this volume, the edited book, Agency in Archaeology, presents the proceedings of a conference aimed at unpacking the notion of agency and making the case for the importance of this concept for uncovering drivers of cultural production and change. Its authors challenge archaeologists to move beyond looking at broad structural and environmental change, and instead to consider the impact of actions by less visible individuals and groups. To this end, the concept of agency is crucial because it opens for recognition of the role and impact of individual human choices and intentions in shaping change. And then Again, building on these earlier studies, the volume Globalization in Prehistory offers a dozen case studies that show how people without history had significant agency in the unfolding of early globalization. They did so in several ways: by their local knowledge of medicinal botany and forest products, providing the hidden foundations for European colonial expansion worldwide, and by their prowess as masters of both maritime and desert transportation, which laid the foundation for networks of trade worldwide. And most of this was happening before the invention of urban centers, states, or empires. The volume that contests the urban statist and imperial bias of much received scholarship on the deep time history of globalization. So in our effort to further interrogate the nature of the social polity of the Iron Age in Transjordan, I bring here a very simplified model for trying to understand the tribal social order, the tribal kingdom. I first published this in the edited volume, Ancient Near East Studies in the Iron Age Moab, edited by Piotr. Here I argue that there are really, I present what I call the polycentric or endemic polycentric model for understanding the Levant. And so what is that model? Well, it contrasts with, there are two sides to it. There's the top-down version of power, which we see in Egypt and Mesopotamia, where there is a movement of toward a centripetal forces that produce a single center, a monocenter, and there's such a social order, a hierarchy comes into being where the subordinates are forced to comply by means of a bureaucracy that enforces the rules and the use of military and force. Command is at the heart of this kind of an political system, and it allows for enormous complexity and grand monumentality. The other alternative is a bottom-up social order, which is sustained by centrifugal forces that pull away from the center, that lead to multiple centers of power or polycentrism. Such a system operates more on the basis of negotiations that involve trust and honor, and end up producing what we call a heterarchy, a place with multiple powers, where consensus between the leaders and the members is key and allows for complexity without grand monumentality. These is just an effort to depict these two models, the hierarchical top-down Egyptian Mesopotamian system versus vis-a-vis the Levantine system, where centrifugal forces have favored polycentrism and heterarchy, trust and honor. And so this then is what I argue is the basis for perhaps a Levantine social order based on here polycentrism, trust and honor, rather than monocentrism, bureaucracy and force, which characterize the more complex civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, what would account for this endemic polycentrism in the Levantine world? Well, there are many factors, but for sure, extreme microecological variance of the region, which allowed for more local autonomy, the proximity of the Arabian Desert, which provided a persistent influx of tribal ideology and practices into the region, the unabated imperial predation, which contributed to a flux in and to a transience of a political dominance by any one imperial power, and of course the Mediterranean Sea itself, and thus creating a more polycentric space, which in this forthcoming volume, Levantine Entanglement, we argue was the basis for the birth and flourishing of a different type of power, that of the canonical ethical religions that contested imperial power. So a very important reason why we get the Bible and even the Quran as a basis for a different type of social order than the empire. Now, while I've tried to give some substance to what this model might be, I would like to note that others are on the same track. And so, for example, again, in his volume, Complex Communities, Ben Porter rejects the claims of top-down centralized social structure in West Central Jordan, favoring instead heterarchy rather than hierarchy, and thus the complex communities of his volume. So he anticipates, you might say, what I argue is the case. And then in a forthcoming article, in Palestine Exploration Quarterly, Zach Thomas shows how the terminology used in the Hebrew Bible to describe social relation maps onto the idea of polycentric social spaces. He and I were colleagues at the Albright a couple of years ago, and I think this is in part an outcome of our conversation. So what are the takeaways and hypotheses from this inquiry? First, the Elman Service model of unilineal evolution from band tribe to chiefdom state is not supported by the archaeological evidence from the late Bronze and Iron Age in Jordan. The rise of state-level polities in Jordan, including in Edom, was facilitated by capabilities and affordances built into the existing kin-based system of social organization. The ideology, language, and sentiments associated with kin-based or tribal organization continued to be utilized even after the emergence of a state-level polity or tribal kingdom. As a kin-based ideology of belonging and cohesion, this system of social order can flex and accommodate more sedentary modes of livelihood, patrimonialism, and more nomadic ones, transhuman. Religious ideology, reflected in iconography and text, played a key role in legitimatizing the rise and rule of tribal kings and kingdoms. This is particularly well illustrated in the case of the extant statutes of kings of the Ammonites. Tribal kings of Iron Age Jordan typically did not succeed in developing long-standing dynasties, grand monumentality, powerful bureaucracies, or standing armies. Power was wielded instead by means of traditional consensus-building mechanisms of tribal elders, the Levantine cultural paradigm. The absence of such key markers of state-level power as those mentioned above is not necessarily a sign of a lack of agency, importance, or relevance of local rulers. This is evidenced not only by these subordinate vassal kings being mentioned by their contemporaries in the much more powerful states of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but also by the achievements of their peoples in realms spanning agriculture, international trade, metallurgy, water management, and much more. Thank you for your attention, and please feel free to send your comments to LaBianca at Andrews EDU.